Hey, good morning. Welcome to Redwood Church. We are so glad that you've joined us on Father's Day Sunday. So happy Father's Day to the dads out there. It's certainly always a special day for me, and particularly has been the past couple years. Is Father's Day is always on Sunday, which means that my son's right behind the camera, producing and managing, and so I get to start out the day with him, and we will spend a lot of good quality time together. Father's Day in our family also is always lands somewhere around, if not on, the same day as my wife's birthday. And so yesterday was Shannon's birthday. So everybody online, if you've not yet wished Shannon a happy birthday, you can wish her a happy birthday. And most of you know that Shannon is also an identical twin. So Shannon and Susan's birthday yesterday. So grateful for my sister-in-law. And their special connection as identical twins. They spent a lot of time together last night, and we all had dinner together and celebrated a little bit. So it was nice. It was a good day and a good weekend to celebrate their birthday, to celebrate Dad's. Grateful for my brothers-in-law, for my father-in-law, and all those incredible men that have meant so much to me over the years. So grateful for all of that as we gather this morning. I also think I'm getting a little Father's Day gift because the weather in Atlanta is breaking a little bit today. We're getting a little cooler, a little less humid, so it'll be a nice day to spend a little time outside. And then it's also U.S. Open Sunday, so I'll probably spend a little time watching some golf along the way. Well, over the past couple of weeks, I have a confession to make, and the confession is that it was the first time in 2 years of Redwood that we had pre-recorded sermons. So the last 2 Sundays, as we continued our sermon series, The Church, those 2 were recorded before Shannon, Zach, and I all left out of town on a pretty incredible journey. Zach had a delayed choir tour that had really been delayed a couple of years because of the pandemic. And so he was traveling to Europe with friends in the choir from Woodward Academy. Shannon and I thought it'd be a good time to join him over there to be able to see him perform one last time with his high school classmates and to have a little bit of a trip as a family. And so we had a wonderful 2 weeks. There were so many highlights, but as far as it relates to Redwood and as far as it relates to the church and the sermon series we've been in, which we're continuing this morning, the church, the highlight of our trip was really our visit to Rome. And we arrived in Rome, and I'd been before. Shannon and Zach had not been. And so it was a special time to be able to introduce them to that city. For me, it had been 32 years since I had last traveled there, which seems hardly possible. But I had memories of visiting, and particularly visiting some of the most important Christian places in Rome. And so we did that together. And so this morning, as we continue our sermon series, The Church, I'm gonna talk a little bit about our experience in Rome and what we experienced there and what it has to say about the sermon series that we've been in. So our scripture this morning comes from the book of Acts, chapter 28, verses 11 through 16. Acts 28, 11 through 16. This is at the very end of Acts, and this is Paul. Paul is writing here, and so here we hear these words from Paul. 3 months later, we set sail on a ship that had wintered on the island, an Alexandrian ship with the twin brothers as its figurehead. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there for 3 days. Then we weighed anchor and came to Rhegium. After 1 day there, a south wind sprang up, and on the 2nd day we came to Puteoli. There we found believers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and so we came to Rome. The believers from there, when they heard of us, came as far from Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. When we came to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier who was guarding him. So I said words of Paul. We're actually Luke writing Acts and telling the story of Paul and the story being told of Paul and his visit to Rome. And so If we look back over this past 6 or 7 weeks, as we've been in this sermon series on the church, we have settled on a working definition of the church as the community of those who belong to Christ, through which the identity of Christ is revealed. The community of those who belong to Christ, through which the identity of Christ is revealed. And so nothing to do with buildings. This all has, as you know, is its origin in kind of our tagline that we don't exist to go to church, we exist to be the church. And so the focus is on the community of faith. And that's what we're focused on. And so when you go to Rome, which is where we find Paul in the book of Acts, what you do as an American tourist in Rome today is that one of the highlights there is to visit Vatican City, to visit St. Peter's Basilica, to see those incredible works of art that are there, to visit the Vatican Museum, to visit the Sistine Chapel. And so we did all of that. On our first afternoon in Rome, we went and walked all the way to the other side of the city. We saw the Colosseum, we saw the Pantheon, we saw the Rome Forum. We saw several churches along the way and visited those. And we saw the famous fountain there and had our picture taken there. And so we saw all of those kind of more secular sites. But the next morning at 7:30, we arrived at the Vatican Museum for a tour of the Vatican Museum that would end in the Sistine Chapel, which is just connected to St. Peter's Basilica. And so we got there early and made our way through. Little did I know that Zach's first response when we got our tickets was on the front of the ticket was a scene from Raphael's famous School of Athens. And we went in the Raphael rooms, and Zach was just absolutely enamored with that piece of art that he had learned about in his European history class and that he had studied. And so that was kind of the beginning of this movement toward the Sistine Chapel. And then you arrive in the Sistine Chapel. There are no photographs permitted. And you go in and you're in awe of this space. You're in awe of the art. We were very excited that on one end, very prominent, was the prophet Zacharias, or Zechariah as it was portrayed there in the Sistine Chapel. There's one level of the art in the Sistine Chapel that are all the prophets. And you look up and you see the stories of Jesus, and then on the one wall is the wall that of the story of the end times, and it's just the imagery is incredible. The space is amazing, and you just sit and you look up and you think about how that ceiling was painted, the detail with which it was painted, the passion with which it was painted, and what happens in that space. It is the space where the cardinals elect the Pope. We were shown where the door was, where the oven is, where they burn the smoke comes out, and if it's the white smoke, then a Pope has been elected. Now, obviously, Redwood Church is a part of the Protestant tradition. We're an independent church in the Wesleyan tradition, which means our roots are back to Protestant, to the Protestant Reformation, and so our roots are kind of a segment off of that church. But when we really look at it, all of our roots kind of lead back to Rome and Jerusalem and the areas in which Paul was in ministry. And so we made our way through all that, and it was so powerful. And you think about, if we go to our text today, Paul had written the letter to the Romans earlier. And in the letter to the Romans, Paul says, I have not yet been able to visit you. I hope to visit you. And he writes this letter, and then at the end of Romans, he once again comes back and says, I hope that I will eventually be able to visit with you. And at that time, I think Paul thought that he would have a mission there, not only like his missions to the other churches, but as we know, Paul actually, as many of us know, Paul actually arrives in Rome as a prisoner. He's been on this ship where he's been a prisoner, and he arrives in Rome as a prisoner. Now, he's given a great deal of latitude. He's kind of on home arrest. So he has this one guard who's responsible for looking after him, but there's no real concern that Paul's going to flight. In fact, Paul has come hoping to have an audience with the government, with the emperor, with the ruling authorities, to state his case for why he is no threat to the Roman Empire. But he comes to Rome, and so we have this kind of this meeting here, and then you find yourself in this city where there's such incredible history, and you hear of Paul being there and being in mission in Rome. Now, what we gather from this is that the church in Rome was really not founded by Paul. Now, this is part of the history that you're reminded of and that you relearn or learn for the first time when you go and visit. And there's so much mystery that is around St. Peter, and it is believed that St. Peter's Basilica is built on the tomb of St. Peter. You can see where that is when you go down beneath St. Peter's Basilica, but there's certainly a lot of mystery, a lot of disagreement by scholars over exactly what that means. Paul's tomb is also in Rome. It was only recently excavated. That is not a site that we visited, but it's one that is there. His sarcophagus has not been opened. The contents of that sarcophagus still remain unknown, but historically, traditionally, it is believed to be where Paul was buried after he was martyred. We do not get the martyrdom of Paul in the New Testament. It is other extra-canonical writings outside the canon of the Bible, from which we learn of Paul's martyrdom. He was a Roman citizen. As a Roman citizen, he was likely beheaded rather than crucified. We believe that Peter was crucified. We were reminded of that history and the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down, which, if you can have a more brutal form of death than a normal crucifixion, an upside down crucifixion would have even been more brutal. And so all of this history comes back to life, and you see it centered here in Paul coming to Rome to see the church in Rome, one that he didn't start, that the tradition says that Peter probably started, that Peter was probably the first pope of the church, why it's called St. Peter's Basilica, why tradition holds that he's buried there. But Paul is welcomed by the church in Rome. They come to greet him from as far as 30 or 40 miles away, these towns that are listed here. And they come to welcome him and greet him. And even as he is under house arrest, he's able to meet with the Christian community in Rome. So what does all this bring to us about this sermon series we've been in called The Church? Most of the churches that we visited had become museums. There's very little religious life that takes place in those spaces anymore. Now, there were several churches we went in that you'd have these large basilicas, cathedrals, these massive structures, and maybe there would be a small mass taking place in a side chapel or often a transept. But these churches, these buildings, churches in the sense that many would identify as a building, these places of worship, these basilicas and cathedrals, are really tourist destinations. In many ways, they have become art galleries to contain this incredible story of the church in art, in paintings, in sculpture, in architecture. But yet, the church, in many ways, no longer exists in those spaces. And it's sad to think about. Now, when you go in St. Peter's Basilica, the first thing you see as you come through the doors on the right, and one of the first things that I was excited for Shannon and Zach to see was the Pietà. Michelangelo's incredible work of Mary holding Jesus. Now, Pietà is any sculpture like that, and so this is the famous one that is there. I'd forgotten that it had actually traveled to the United States many years ago. It made a tour. It was damaged at one point, so now it's behind glass. A woman tried to break it, and so it's now protected behind glass. It's a powerful, powerful piece of art. And it reminds you that so much of the art in the Renaissance and on either side of it was dedicated to the Christian faith. The church was one of the primary patrons of the arts. And so the reason that Sistine Chapel was painted was because a pope commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel and to come back and paint the large wall. And so these artists were commissioned to do these pieces of art dedicated, these sacred pieces of art. And so you go in and you see that, and then you walk around and you see just the grandeur. And so you ask yourself, in a world with so much need, with so much pain, suffering, and poverty, how do you justify these grand spaces? And in one way, it's kind of impossible to justify. At the same time, part of the purpose of these spaces was to inspire the church and to speak to the grandeur of God. It was an edifice to God. It was a way to try to honor God. Now, a couple weeks ago, in one of the sermons that I preached that was pre-recorded, I had this quote that I think so powerful, that we were reminded that it makes a difference to see the church not as a place to go, but as a living offering to God. In those days, the church was thought of as a physical offering to God. These cathedrals, these vast spaces, were built as an offering to God. Unfortunately, that was often done on the backs of those who could least afford it, and people died building these grand spaces, and so many resources were used to build them. And so there's this kind of mixed, and there's this tension around these spaces, but they inspire. They are amazing. You walk in, you look up at the dome at St. Peter's, and you just can't help to feel, one, very small, which part of the purpose is to make you to put it on such a scale that God is so much bigger than any of us. And it's also just to experience that grandeur. So we spent a good bit of time in that space, walking around and looking at the various art that was all throughout. Now, one of the things that occurred to me is that people will spend a couple of hours in line just to get in St. Peter's Basilica. Entrance into the Basilica is free. Anyone can stand in line on days that it's open and get in. We paid for a tour for the Vatican Museum, but anyone can stand in line, and people will stand in line for a couple of hours to look inside that building. But many who were in there, it was clear from how they behaved, how they walked through, that they were looking at a historical monument rather than a place of worship. They were taking selfies in front of sacred pieces of art, depictions of some of the most sacred moments from the history of the Christian church. And as we looked at that, it wasn't in a judgmental way, but it was in a way to recognize the ways in which the church has failed and the ways in which the influence of the church has waned and continues to do so exponentially. And so what do we take from our trip and the experiences we had? After Rome, we traveled to Florence, and other sacred piece that I was so excited for Shannon and Zach to see was the David. And I was afraid that I'd built it up too much. Much as I knew that you couldn't build up St. Peter's Basilica too much. I mean, there's no way that a person walks in that space and is just not overwhelmed by the grandeur of it. But the David is one in which I was afraid, if I built this up too much. I mean, you've seen pictures of it, but I remember seeing it in person for the first time and just being absolutely in awe of the detail and the power in that slab of marble. When Shannon and Zach walked in, it was one of those times in which that I had not oversold it and that it exceeded their expectations as we walked around that statue and saw the detail where you can see the bones in David's hands, the veins in his hands and his arms, the definition, the muscle, the collarbone, everything about that statue, that sacred piece of art, the young boy David prepared to fight Goliath. Whether he's preparing or after he had just defeated him, the inspiration behind that, the beauty of that, is just absolutely amazing. And it was all a part of the church's desire to tell the story of the church. And so we come back to our text from this morning, and it says that Paul, that Paul talks about the courage necessary to be in ministry to the church in Rome. And I found this quote in one of the commentaries. It said this: "The courage necessary for prophetic ministry is not a virtue that is one cultivates by self-discipline or by self-confidence, but by submission to God." And so the courage that we need to be the church in a almost exponentially evolving world, a world in which the church is exponentially losing its influence, that we are almost back to a time that we can imagine when Paul first arrives in Rome and is trying to minister to a fledgling church. As we know, it was Constantine who became the first Christian emperor, and there's questions as to how faithful he really was, but regardless of his personal faith, the fact that he was baptized in the faith, the fact that he accepted the faith, the fact that he allowed people to openly profess their faith was really what began to allow the church to flourish. And it's in many ways why we are gathered here together today. Vastly different in this virtual experience than it would have been to walk into one of these magnificent churches in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century in the history of the church. I long for a day when people will stand in line for 2 hours, not to just see a museum, but to gather for worship, to gather to be the church, so that the church can continue to transform the world. So it was a wonderful trip for us, and grateful to be home, and grateful to be back live with you this morning, and grateful for the opportunity to worship together this morning. Will you pray with me? Almighty God, as we gather this morning, we're mindful of our past and of our history, but we're also mindful that we must look forward, that the church builds on its history. It looks to history to inform our future. If we get stuck in the past, we are not helpful. We are not the hands and feet of Christ that we need to be for the world. And so be with us as Redwood seeks to be the church that you need us to be. Today we give thanks for dads, for fathers, for those men who work so hard to teach their children of who you are and what you mean in their lives. It really is the most important task we have as dads, is to pass along the faith to our children. I also give you thanks for Shannon and Susan, for their lives, for their birthday, and for all those who celebrate this weekend in so many ways. God, we continue to pray for the world, for chaos, for war, for pain, for suffering. May your Spirit be present with all those this day that need to know of your love and your grace and your mercy. We ask all of this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. We are so excited that next Sunday, the 26th, we will be gathering on location again. And so Zach's got the information up there. It'll be where we gathered for Easter. And so if you're in town, if you're nearby, we hope that you will gather with us next Sunday at 10 a.m. on location. I think Zach's got the information up there for you. We will have reminders throughout the week on social media, so stay connected with us at redwoodchurchatl.org and at redwoodatl across social media. We'll make sure you have all the information you need. There will be people there to welcome you about 9:30. We'll begin worship at 10. This is going to be a wonderful time, and the plan is that we will actually live stream the service as we did on Easter Sunday morning. So whether you can be with us on location or on through the various channels, the website, YouTube, Facebook, we will all gather next Sunday morning, the 26th. We will wrap up our sermon series, The Church. I've been working hard on this one. I hope that you will join us, because it's kind of culmination of everything we've learned over these last 7 or 8 weeks. And so join us. Hope that you have a wonderful Father's Day and a great week. Take care. God bless.